last week. At this moment, as many of you know, probably most of you know, Russian forces are continuing their advance into the heart of Ukraine toward the capital city of Kiev and other locations. As we watch these scenes of destruction and streams of refugees trying to get out of the country, of course, we're dependent for much of what we know on journalists, both within and outside of Ukraine. This is another war, in other words, that's being mediated for us. And for the mediators, the work comes with challenges ranging from access to key locations and authoritative sources to today's unique misinformation environment that adds to the expected fog of war. So we're fortunate today to have three panelists with us to help put some perspective on all of this. I am really pleased that Sasha Yaroshchuk is able to join us. He is a former Ukrainian journalist who was a Fulbright Scholar working with me here at IU last year. He just returned to Ukraine in January, and he joins us from central Ukraine. He tells us he's safe there for the moment and is pleased to be with us and be able to talk to us. Also joining us on the panel is Elaine Monaghan, professor of practice here at the Media School, who was a Reuters correspondent in Kiev, Minsk, and Moscow between 1994 and 1997. And Steve Raymer, professor emeritus, who reported on the former Soviet Union as a photojournalist at National Geographic for many, many years. So each panelist is going to make a few remarks today, and then we will have Q&A. We'll go directly to Q&A from the audience. For those of you who are in the audience, thank you for joining us. First of all, you can begin submitting your questions anytime in the Q&A interface down at the bottom. And we'll be monitoring that and asking your questions for you. And we'll go ahead and get started and begin with Sasha. Sasha, thank you so much for being here with us. To begin with, can you tell us the situation where you are, and then tell us a little bit about the media situation?
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. Nice to join the colleagues from the IU. I am also in IU hoodie today. As Jerry told everyone, I am in central Ukraine. I returned to Kyiv, then I decided to join my parents because I haven't seen them for almost more than 9 months. So, and I was planning actually to go back to Kyiv last week on the morning when the war broke out, but my plans were ruined because of the situation. I decided it's better to stay here, because when I saw all of these rockets hitting the ground, hitting the buildings, military infrastructure, mostly in Kyiv, I decided it's better to stay here and to be in safety, at least for now. I hope that won't change, at least here, and the situation will be over soon. I just also wanted to make a little remark here, Jerry, that the Russian troops were mostly stopped in the places that they conquered, seized on the first 2 days of the invasion, and now we have this kind of a defense around the major cities on the north of this Kharkiv, Kyiv, Chernobyl, Sumy, and other. We still have some problems in the south, but they kind of advancing in small groups to some major cities, trying to gain control over those cities. But our people are so brave that they move forward and defend their cities without arms, and trying to say to the soldiers of the Russian army that they are not welcome here. And those soldiers with tanks, with artillery, with everything, move around and go back. So our people just show their bravery and strength against this aggression. In terms of the media, I would like here to stress, I guess, few phenomena which show how the situation is different from what we saw in 2014. So first of all, at the moment, all our media community is very united. So we don't have, for instance, in television at the moment, we don't have every TV channel saying different things about what's happening, but we have all of the TV channels working on and providing information together. We call this a national marathon to inform about the situation in the country and on the ground. about economic situation, political situation, about negotiations with our Western and European partners and the United States, and about what's happening in the east of the country. So that's a kind of a different things, and it works 24/7. So you can watch it even at night, and the news come fresh and fresh and fresh. As I also report if there is some air alert. So when you have to go to some shelter and to hide from the bombs, you will hear this from the television. Another thing, I guess, which is very important, that today many people receive information about the war from the social media. Especially we have this social media app which is called Telegram, where we have different channels and there are different news media and just volunteers who post their opinions and recent news about the situation on the ground. What I don't see, and that's a problem, I don't see a lot of regional media reporting from these major hotspots, like from Kharkiv. We see official reports, but we don't see, for some reason, media reports, and I cannot understand why. For instance, in 2014, I remember so many news organizations that journalists, just freelance journalists, were embedded with different army brigades, army units. Today, we don't have this. Maybe I first of all, I talk about Ukrainian journals because obviously I mostly follow Ukrainian media, but I don't see that. When we here's a good thing that foreign journalists, Europe, United States, Canada, Japan, Turkey, and many other countries come to Ukraine now and report about the events. Recently, there was data that more than 2,000 journalists came to Ukraine in the recent week to report about the situation here on the ground in Ukraine. So I guess, I hope that you may tell me if you hear what's happening here or not very well, if you receive this information or not. That would be good if you can share this with me. So like basically, I don't feel any lack of information, general information, but there is some points where we can have to make some changes here that would, I guess, improve the things. Because it's very important to show the truth, to show what's happening here, and I can compare this with the situation back there on the other side in Russia or in Belarus, where they say just nonsense. They say stupid things about the situation here. Just a little bit in the past, I guess it started on February 17th. So what they did, they started to make videos, news reports in the news about different assumed atrocities by Ukrainian forces. When negotiations in the Minsk format, in the Normandy format, all these last negotiations between the United States on the one side and Russia on the other side for this security agreements, security guarantees, I guess how Russia wanted to call them, failed. On the second day, on the day after this negotiations failed, they started to make these provocations, media provocations. So they claimed, for instance, that Ukrainian forces just killed a child somewhere on the occupied Donbass, that they are staging a chemical provocation, that they want to make a nuclear bomb, that the Ukrainian army is plans to advance and to gain control over the lost territories, I mean Donetsk and Lugansk, and different other things. And this was staged in so way that like everyone was laughing here in Ukraine, but they knew what they did. They wanted to find the cause to war. How do they say to their people, why do they do this? Why do they engage in this war and these fightings? And now what yesterday, today and yesterday, our media and our government was were speaking about the Belarus, because for now, like Russia, Belarus didn't send their forces, even though there were some media reports about that some Belarus forces advanced and now in Ukraine, but it seems to be wrong. And they only use Belarus land for planes and for rockets. That's all, and for just troops. Their Russian troops are in Belarus at the moment. But we had the reports, information, our security source in Ukraine reported that Russia is now staging a provocation on the Ukrainian Belarusian garden to try to accuse Ukrainian bodyguards in killing Belarusian bodyguards. And they want this to be an official pretext for Belarus to declare a war against Ukraine. So they use the media to declare a war, to make the war like justifiable for their at least audience, even though everyone outside Russia understands that that's just a provocation. Because they have been living in this kind of information vacuum since 2013 at least. And now this information vacuum in Russia is growing. It's become much stronger. It's like they built some kind of an information firewall where the information outside cannot penetrate inside, or information from inside cannot penetrate outside, go outside, so that the Russian people don't know about the situation in Ukraine, in the world, and the world don't know about the situation in Russia, because both of the situation scenarios are bad for the current Russian oligarchy, kleptocracy, and Putin himself. And recently, today, they started blocking YouTube, or at least access was limited. The same access was limited to Facebook, to Twitter, to internet in general. And what's left is just these propaganda TV channels and newspapers. And many people just say this nonsense about Nazis in Ukraine, the fascist junta in Ukraine. And they don't understand what they say actually, but they repeat what their media anchors, news anchors say. And this makes like feel a little bit desperate, because I don't know, personally as a journalist, I don't know how to change the situation. I cannot do anything to help those people know the situation here. Some of course understand, but some don't. And now also the Russian government also wants to deprive Ukrainians of access to information in Ukraine. So yesterday they targeted a TV tower in Kyiv, the major TV tower. They missed a little bit. They hit, actually, they used 2 rockets. One hit a special room where all of this infrastructure is located that broadcast signals. It can be restored. Fortunately, the tower is safe. And another rocket hit a sanctuary, actually, a place where many Jews were buried during the World War II, during the Holocaust. And a crime, actually, a war crime. But returning to this media thing, they try to target these TV towers yesterday they targeted in Kyiv, today they targeted in Luhansk region and also in Kharkiv. So the 2 regions close to Russia that they want to gain control over first, and then to target the TV towers in other regions, so that at least the people don't have access to TV. Maybe then they would move forward and start taking control over internet or other communication. That would be a disaster. Fortunately, our government, key organizations in the government, like Ministry of Defense, they have access to Starlink now, so that helps. But what about everyone else? I don't know. If they manage to cut access to internet and TV, this would be a very big problem for us.
Oh, thank you for that, Sasha. Much to think about and follow up on there, but I want to move now to our next panelist, Elaine. And I'll just, before we do that, remind people watching in the audience that you're welcome to submit questions. We have a lot of good questions rolling in right now that I will pose to the panelists for you. And so you can do that in the Zoom interface there at the bottom. And we look forward to hearing and seeing more of your questions come in. So now to Professor of Practice, Elaine Monaghan.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Sasha. It's great to be here with all of you today. I won't say too much because I'd like to give space for questions and so on, but I'll explain first of all why I'm part of this conversation, what my perspective on it is, and just tell you a couple of things that might be useful to listeners or watchers as consumers of news, but also as people who are interested in how journalists do their work in these situations. So I was a correspondent for Reuters. I was chief correspondent in Ukraine back in the 90s, and also covered events in Belarus when the current Belarusian president came to power, and all these years later, he's still there. So I guess that's one of the things that strikes me as we're having this conversation, is how situations can last for a long time. And that the role of journalists and in those kinds of these kinds of circumstances is incredibly important, and perhaps this is one of those moments where we can all understand just how important the role of journalists actually is, to Sasha's point that he's not seeing as much coverage locally. And obviously, if you're in a war zone situation trying to work as a correspondent, it can be extremely difficult for the same reasons as you all see on social media, that there's lots of dis and misinformation coming at you, and when you're actually feet on the ground trying to cover a story, you can't move with the kind of speed that people do when they're on social media. And at the same time, a journalist's eyewitness report from the ground is more valuable than any other piece of information that you can get if it's from a reliable, responsible, well-trained journalist. And that's, of course, where it gets really complicated, because as members, or consumers of that journalism, you have to be able to make that judgment. But some of the kind of interesting strategies that have really come to the fore in the last few days as we've been watching this horrible situation have included journalists using what's called user-generated content, or UGC. And lots of big newsrooms now are able to collect lots of information online and then verify it and then share it with their audiences. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. So in that sense, nothing has changed, because even when you're out in the field before there was social media, we were always verifying information that was coming in our direction. But now we can do that on social media using information that is delivered not by journalists, but by actual witnesses, people who are affected by the conflict. So that's kind of a new element of journalism that wasn't around back in the day when I was in Kiev. So that's one element that I wanted to just touch on. I also just wanted to point out that for journalists working in a conflict zone, they are subject to exactly the same dangers as the people around them. And it's sometimes easy to forget that as a consumer of news, that you're looking at human beings, and they're human before they're journalists, and they're in danger also. What's slightly different for journalists, of course, is that if they're working for large news organizations, they have access to resources that ordinary folk don't, including, for example, security experts who will help them make decisions like, is it safe to walk down that street right now? Is it safe to go outside and cover the story right now? Should I be standing on this roof or not? So these are not decisions that are made in a haphazard fashion for journalists who work for large news organizations. But then, of course, you have lots of freelance journalists who don't have access to those kinds of resources. And for them, it's much more perilous, frankly. So that's something to bear in mind. So I guess the technology aspect of it certainly gives journalists more choices about how they can cover a story that they didn't have before, but that doesn't necessarily mean that what they collect is going to be more accurate. That all still comes down to the training that journalists receive and the editorial decisions that are made in newsrooms. So I wanted to show you one thing that I thought was an interesting example of journalists using their resources, namely reports from people on the ground, because one of the things that we haven't been seeing is the consequences for Russian soldiers of this war. And let me just share this with you for one moment. Here it is. So this is an example of a story that was built around voice messages that were coming in to, in this case, the Kiev Independent. And this journalist, Ilya Ponomarenko, is reporting on stories about a Russian town where local people there learned that a lot of soldiers had been killed, which of course is something that you're not able to see on the ground easily. So that's an example, just using voice message that somebody had gotten access to and then reported on. And you can see that the voice message is embedded inside the story. So that's one example of people using the resources where they can't necessarily be on the ground. Another example is of the New York Times, which verified some video, which I'm going to try and show you right now. If you just give me a moment and I'll pull this up. 1 second, sorry. Okay, all right. Sorry, I'm having lots of trouble finding this link to show you on the screen. Here it is. Okay. So this is a video, this kind of, that shows some of the destruction happening at a town called Borodyanka. And as you can see, this reporter who works for the New York Times is back in the newsroom collecting this information and then showing it to the audience, having verified the video. And I'll just show you a little part of it. So I should note that there's the Russian language is not being translated in the, there's a lot of expletives in it for obvious reasons. So again, this is video that's been collected by a local person and then filtered through the New York Times verification process. And then the last thing I wanted to share was just a minute of video from Sarah Seidner, who's a senior correspondent for CNN and is currently on the, or was when I last messaged with her, on this Polish side of the Ukrainian-Polish border, covering the flow of refugees out of Ukraine into Poland. And this is, I think this is interesting because it just kind of gives you a flavor of what it's actually like being a journalist in these kinds of circumstances. I think the thing that, as awful as this story is, when you're out there covering these kinds of conflicts, you see humanity at its very best and also obviously at its very worst. But the day-to-day existence of a reporter in these moments is not always as dramatic as what you see on your television screen. So here Sarah's talking a little bit about what it's like being on the ground on the Polish side of the border. Let me just share that with you for a moment.
Elaine, we don't have audio on the clip. Elaine, we are not getting audio on that clip. Apologies to folks.
Sorry, Jenny, was the video not coming through just now?
The video was fine. We weren't getting the audio.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll stop right there because it was working before, and I'm not sure what it is with the settings that I could quickly fix. But just very briefly, Sarah's talking about how normal life is going on the Polish side of the border, and she's able to go and buy coffees and do all the things that people need to do in order to get their jobs done in Poland as reporters. So yeah, I'll stop right there and hand it back to you then, Jerry.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Elaine, and sorry about the technical difficulties for you and for the audience. That is a clip worth watching, which you can find on CNN, of course, CNN's website. Great, and now we will turn to our final panelists before we get to our questions and answers. Just a reminder that you can type your questions in and we will pose them for you to the panelists here. So let's go to Professor Emeritus Steve Raymer. Steve.
Myself, and I'm going to share the screen, Jerry, if that's okay. And can you see my PowerPoint now?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here and scrolling through the people who have registered for our presentation this afternoon. It's great to see so many former students who are in the audience. I'll try to be brief and talk about three subjects. One is a bit about my time reporting in Ukraine and in Russia and the former Soviet Union. Secondly, a bit about media censorship during this crisis, and particularly focusing on the Russian media. And then finally, the scarcity or absence or dearth of intimate, heart-wrenching images of war with all of its violence in the news media here in North America. Why is the public and our neighbors and friends and fellow workers and students, why are they really not seeing the reality that we can see on the ground? And it's certainly not because there are not good images out there. Well, my introduction to Ukraine and the Soviet it came during the time of the big bad Soviet Union in 1986. I applied for and won, I guess, a fellowship to Stanford University in 1984 and 1985 to study with Condoleezza Rice, who was a young assistant professor, and others to learn as much as I could in a year or a bit longer than a year about Russia and the former Soviet Union. And it was a time of a tremendous number of restrictions during the Cold War on Western journalists. I put just a couple of them in a PowerPoint here. We had administrative problems where we had a whole system of open and closed cities in the United States and the Soviet Union, and agreements that were designed to keep diplomats, spies, and Western journalists in place. For example, Seattle was a closed city to all Soviet journalists, just as Vladivostok, the port on the Pacific coast in far eastern Russia or Siberia, was during the Cold War a closed city to all Americans. And I have to say that in all the time I've worked in the former Soviet Union and in Russia, I have never been to Vladivostok. We were constantly accompanied by minders, escorts from the government, various government agencies. We were considered spies because many Russian journalists or Soviet journalists actually were spies or had a second job as a spy. There was a fair amount of intimidation and threats and constant surveillance by the KGB. We needed visas and special papers for places that foreigners were not allowed to visit. The usual problems of your Soviet minders or guides demanding bribes to really do their job, conflicts obviously of ideology. We see the role of free and independent media in one way, and our interlocutors are on the Soviet side and the Russian side, it was different. And just meeting ordinary people was very difficult. And I included this picture of two Ukrainian people in not so far from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, but it's not because it's a great picture. I wanted you to see my KGB minder who was accompanying me and monitoring every word that this nice Ukrainian couple had to say. And on to Ukraine. My job or the job of a photojournalist, whether it's Ukraine or the state of Indiana, I think is basically the same. And that's to be an eyewitness for history, to expose social problems, and to show us our common humanity, and to humanize life and humankind. And this lead picture in a National Geographic story on Ukraine might be an example of this. Certainly my mission at the end of the Cold War was to push open the doors as wide as possible, and to take advantage of President Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, or openness in the society and an openness to Soviet history, as well as to show Soviet people, whether they were Russian or Cossack, or even the Yupik Eskimos who reside along the coast of the Chukchi Peninsula on the far northeast of Siberia, opposite Nome, Alaska, to show people as people and to try to understand them and their culture better. Anyway, on to Ukraine. The Cossacks, who once dominated eastern Ukraine, are today a group of the past, but Ukraine continues to be a country of heavy industry with, and particularly output of steel, which is exported far and wide, particularly to Asia and to Australia. Also, Ukraine is important agriculturally. It's the #3 exporter of wheat in the world, #1 in sunflower, and important as well in dairy products. And again, trying to humanize the Ukrainian farmer was an object of my work, as well as humanizing the people who live in Ukraine. And the sign here in Ukrainian, and again, trying to find that Ukrainian identity, the sign is in Ukrainian and it says dairy products. In fact, my time in Ukraine at the end of the Soviet period up until 1991 was constantly one of trying to detect and show and visualize the identity of Ukrainian people and that search for identity. The photograph on the left is a monument from the Bolshevik era after the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Bolshevik monument in Kiev. And this is a monument to Mother Russia being united with Ukraine. And I just happened to find that couple who were united themselves. But the idea that Russia and Ukraine were one. However, there are other ways to find and detect that Ukrainian identity. Our KGB minders were against me going, so many of the things I wanted to do. And one Sunday afternoon, I just drove to the grave of Tsar Shevchenko, who was, one of Ukraine's great poets, writers, painters, ethnographers, and political activists, very much involved in the 19th century in the revival of the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian identity. And, some things are just serendipitous in our work. And I found a woman sitting beneath his bust at his tomb who was actually reading Shevchenko's poetry. We go along. And faith is also an area where we who work in the visual world can try to find identity. There is the Russian Orthodox Church. There is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. There's also a Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church that in fact was banned during Soviet times because it looks not to Moscow, but it looks to Rome and the Pope for its guidance and leadership. And in fact, my wife did her PhD on them. And of course, the Jewish community. We mentioned that underneath that television tower that was hit yesterday by a cruise missile is a monument to a place called Baba Yar, where 33,000 Ukrainian Jews were murdered by the Nazis in, I think it was 1941. The Jewish community, I was looking for evidence that it still existed. And in fact, it has substantially increased in recent years. And so it's no longer just the elderly Jews reading the Torah and the scriptures on the Sabbath, but it is a much more vibrant community. Again, I mentioned the idea of humanizing people. That's one thing that visual journalists can do, is show us our connections to humankind, one person to another. And in fact, with the reputation of the former Soviet Union as being so drab, I was quite always surprised to find the vibrance, the vitality, and the warmth of the Ukrainian people. And, you know, of course, this is the port of Odessa, just to familiarize yourself with the South, which is now in Soviet hands. I wanted to mention also the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, because during my time in Ukraine in 1986, why the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. And at first, authorities were unwilling to allow me any access. And so I started to scoop up pictures from for National Geographic, from every source I could find. And interestingly, but probably not a surprise, much of the good images were taken by Soviet photographers, and I was constantly looking for their negatives or pictures. And on the right of that small Polaroid picture is a doctor from Los Angeles named Robert Gale, who went to work, had good access with the Soviets. And he was one of my keys to get in. A picture on the left is from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories outside of San Francisco, where our nuclear weapons are designed, among other things. But they did have samples of blood from people in the Chernobyl blast area. And the US Department of Energy was looking for genetic mutations in the blood of people who lived near Chernobyl. Every time I went to Chernobyl, and I think it's a total of 3 times now, I carried a dosimeter that would tell me when I'd reached the level of a chest x-ray. But these are the little cars that we took, and we were constantly checked for radiation. We journalists, and I'm sure Elaine would agree, and Jerry, that we've all worked out there in the trenches. And one of the skills we perfect is learning to read what's on a person's desk upside down. I hope that Jerry and Elaine agree. And I was talking to this official from the US Department of Energy at Lawrence Livermore Labs, and he had this map on his desk. And I was trying to read it, and I finally said, you know, that doesn't show, does it, the effects of Chernobyl? And he said, yeah, take a look. Here's where radiation went into the atmosphere on day 2, how far, how high it got and how widespread it was in Asia on day 6. And then let's look at day 10, how that radiation, strontium and cesium particularly, had spread not only through Asia and Africa and even parts of the Arabian Gulf, South Asia, but look at California and all the way to the dairy cattle in Colorado. And in fact, milk in Colorado was pulled off the shelves on day 10. And I said to this gentleman, I said, is there any chance I could take this back to National Geographic? And he said, if you can get it out of here, you can have it. And we rolled it up, and he escorted me to the door. I went out and put it in the trunk of my rental car and drove immediately to the San Francisco airport. Some of the other pictures from the Chernobyl thing. The last thing I want to talk about, and put my professor hat on, is to talk a little bit about, or two things. One is about the Russian media. It is highly censored today, just as protest is censored. And this morning, listeners to Echo Moscow or Echo Muscovy were treated not to an independent voice, but to static. The Soviet authorities have taken Echo Muscovy off the radio. You can still find it on the internet. And in fact, this is their website this morning. And the story says is about, I'm trying to read here. The story says this is day 7 and what's going on in Ukraine. So they're still on the internet, but Soviet authorities and the censor board is now fining media outlets the equivalent of $60,000 US for using such words as evasion, attack, and declaration of war. So, you know, here is one independent voice virtually silenced unless you can have the net. Another independent voice, which has been a thorn in the side of the Soviet authorities, is the newspaper Novaya Gazeta, or New Newspaper. And this was their website this morning in English. It's in English and Russian, but you can see that they are still pushing the envelope, you know, on day 7 with stories that are accurate and authentic and you know, wide ranging, and we'll see how long that lasts. Dmitry Muratov, Novaya Gazeta's Nobel Prize winning editor-in-chief, said he will not accept official information about Ukraine and is relying only on his own correspondence and newsroom to verify facts. And finally, if we go to television, the only remaining television channel has been taken off the air. This is Television Rain, R-A-I-N, and yet it's still on YouTube. And so if you understand Russian, you can still go to YouTube and type in Television Rain, simple English words. And the first thing to come up with their broadcast, if you look at the last line of type there in pink and white, it says basically, these people are foreign agents, and the government has imprinted this on their signal. But their broadcasts, as I say, are on YouTube and are still a voice of authentic information. It's kind of anybody's guess how long they may stay on the air. They're normally broadcast, of course, on cable television throughout Russia, but today it's just YouTube. And if you'd like to hear a decent interview with their editor-in-chief, why CNN had an interview with their editor-in-chief just the other day, and I can give you, I'm trying to think, where is it? I can give you their link here, had it up. Anyway, I can send you a link because CNN had a pretty decent link. Finally, let's just talk for a second about images. There's no doubt there are great and moving and empathetic and intimate images of the cost of war, but they're being published not here in the United States, but probably, as you would expect, in Europe. And of course, we could talk for the rest of the afternoon about standards in the print media and broadcast media between Europe and North America. But why don't I just run through a few images? A lady who was wounded in an explosion, probably the most iconic image that I have seen to date is this image of a dead Russian soldier next to a blown up armored personnel carrier, which used that large in the New York Times last Saturday. But this is the exception, not the rule. Here's a man shocked by obviously the death of his friend, Lindsay Addario, one of the great American photojournalists of our age, had this photograph a day or so ago on the front page of the New York Times of women volunteers, and the woman in the center is weeping as she is about to be deployed to the front. And, you know, blown up Soviet tanks. I actually think that picture on the left, without bodies, without blood, is a fairly symbolic and iconic photograph of what's going on today. There are no shortage, though, of images, whether it's of the Russian hardware, their attack helicopters, or Ukrainian women who have been volunteered to fight the aftermath of these cruise missile attacks and rocket attacks on civilian areas. But we just haven't seen these images in our newspapers, whether we're talking about online or in the few of us in print. Where we are seeing powerful images, of course, is on television, and particularly CNN is getting. I think Vanity Fair magazine the other day called CNN the gold standard for coverage, having flooded the zone with so many journalists. And Clarissa Ward and her empathetic coverage the other day of refugees in a metro station in Kharkiv was to me profound. I felt like I was there. She is a woman of compassion and empathy and real courage. Now, we might say, why? What's the problem? Why are we not seeing these images, even though they exist? I would only suggest that perhaps for students in the audience who really wanted to pursue this, Susan Moeller at the University of Maryland has a book called Compassion Fatigue that gives us some of those answers. And all I could do maybe this afternoon is define for you what compassion fatigue means vis-a-vis journalism. I mean, it's a well-known psychiatric term, but in journalism, we say that compassion fatigue is characterized by a gradual lessening of compassion or caring over time, and caring or compassion on the part of our audience. And it comes from constant overexposure to strong, violent, and this is the important thing, decontextualized images and text that are where our readers, viewers, and clickers lose their ability to feel. They over time, particularly because images are so decontextualized, readers and clickers and viewers lose that ability to feel the pain, particularly in complicated, dramatic, and delicate situations. And all I can do is just, I'm almost done, just looking at the front pages of some American or some world newspapers. The Toronto Globe and Mail this morning shows an empty playground. Okay, this morning's Washington Post and this morning's Jerusalem Post show the cruise missile attack on the television and radio tower in Kiev. But again, it's from a distance and it's hardware. Our own Indianapolis Star and the Austin American, Austin, Texas, home of the University of Texas, and to what seems like in the this burgeoning tech community, a city over 1 million, the best they can do is a Ukrainian flag. Whereas in Arnold Schwarzenegger's hometown of Graz, Austria, I think we get a little closer up feeling of what it's like to be a refugee. This morning's Los Angeles Times, somewhere there, has several bodies of Russian soldiers. San Jose, California, we see that President Biden dominates things. There's a small story at the bottom. The Daily Mail in London is tabloid, but it's that same explosion. Des Moines, Iowa, where we're going to have, traditionally have the first primary in the nation. Lots of political focus. There is not a story today about Ukraine. The Colorado Springs Gazette has a Ukraine story, and it's a Ukrainian soldier by some burned up tanks. The most important newspaper in Seoul, South Korea, has at least a photograph of the aftermath of the attack in Kharkiv. And finally, last but not least, the China Daily has our friend and the great leader Xi Jinping talking about everything but Ukraine. And I contrast that, at least with the Guardian in Great Britain, that makes all of us, I think, feel like what it might be to be in that crowd of refugees. So I'm going to finish. Happy to answer questions. And I'm sorry if I took too much time. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. So building on your the images of international media coverage of the situation, I wonder if I might ask Sasha, what do you think and this is a question from the audience, what do you think the news coverage out of Ukraine is missing when you contemplate the sorts of foreign coverage of the situation that you're seeing? What is it we need to see more of?
Yeah, it's a nice and thoughtful and deep question. Actually, it's not easy to answer here right away. I don't believe that the focus here is that and this picture, these images on this newspapers show that mostly the major cities are covered at the moment. So Kharkiv and Kyiv, I guess, only both of the cities were mentioned. But there are a lot more places that must be covered, or at least maybe journalists must try to go there and cover them, because situation in all those cities, even further west or south from Kharkiv, is much more desperate than in Kharkiv. Whereas in Kharkiv, there is still some access to the city by train or by cars, trucks. Access to other cities in the eastern Ukraine, in this Donbas region, is much worse. So it would be nice if the media can keep an eye on that. And since these places need humanitarian assistance, they need the World Humanitarian Organizations like the Red Cross and others to help Ukrainian government to bring their humanitarian aid to those regions. I guess here the media might be a very powerful instrument to say to the audience in the West, and especially to these organizations who listen to what media in the West say, to keep an eye on the situation there. And I guess that's the most important at the moment.
I'm going to ask another fairly somewhat closely related question to you, Sasha, and I'll move to some other questions for Elaine and Steve. One of the, and I'm thinking about this question in relation to what Steve mentioned about this independent newspaper, Nobel Prize winning newspaper, or at least the publisher of the newspaper, Novaya Gazeta in Russia, which seems to be perhaps an exception. One of the questioners wants to know what Russian civilians are being told about the war. What do they believe is the reason for the conflict? And you mentioned, maybe touched on that a little bit in your introduction.
Yes.
I wonder if you might expand on that based on what you're seeing.
Yeah, actually here wants to add to what Steve said in his speech, that he mentioned glasnost, the period at the end of the Soviet Union. What's interesting now is that the glasnost is over in Russia at the moment. So there's the ability, this information firewall, this vacuum, and the same that was in the Soviet Union before glasnost, before Gorbachev. They didn't have access to, almost didn't have access to what the Western media say. It happens now again. Maybe for now in a little bit less degree, but still it's it's more it's the information vacuum is becoming stronger and stronger. Usually the media starting from 2014 were saying the same things about Ukraine, the same narratives, such as that Ukraine is a Nazi country, that Ukraine is ruled by a illegitimate fascist government or junta, as they say it, that Ukrainians or Ukrainian government, they pretend to make they pretend that they have a difference, that Ukrainian government is bad and Ukrainian people and Russian people are the same family. So they cannot be bad, but they just don't understand what's happening, and that they are under the influence of the Ukrainian American propaganda. So they say that Ukraine is ruled by the United States, so that the US government says to the Ukrainian government what to do and what to say to the people. So that's like that's the main narrative here. But on the if we want to see it deeper, then they say about this Nazi regime, about for instance, that Ukraine is becoming an anti-Russia country, a Russophobic country, that Ukraine bans Russian language and the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, and all that stuff. Before the war broke out, this the new stage of war, because actually the war started in 2014 and never ended. Just it was in a much less degree, but at this moment, in February, they started to accelerate, to engage in new provocations in Donbass, and they were kind of like doing different provocations, saying that Ukraine is preparing for war with Donbass, and that the Russian government must protect people in Donbass, and then Russian-speaking people in Ukraine against the atrocities of the Ukrainian Nazi government. So this is the main narrative. And I can tell you a personal experience. So I have relatives in Russia. I don't talk to them very often. Usually my parents talk sometimes. And I don't know if we will be in contact anymore, because they are also influenced by this propaganda. And I was trying to pursue them that it's not true, that what you see, what you hear from television in Russia is just nonsense. But recently, on last Thursday, on the February 21st, when the war broke out, they called us, and we decided to respond. And after just engaging in a regular conversation, like we said that we had like the situation here is very bad. But they asked us what's happening. So they even didn't know that the war broke out. And when we told them that Putin declared a war against Ukraine, they told us that he did the right thing, because in Ukraine, war crimes were and are committed against the people, and that they must stop the crimes of the Ukrainian government. So they really believe in this nonsense. And here, I personally always ask myself, what should I do? What media should do in this case? And I still cannot find the right answer.
Wow. Thank you for answering that question. Before I ask the next question, just a programming note for the audience, for the panelists, I'm going to exercise my moderator's privilege to extend the time here. We were scheduled to run from 4 to 5, but we'll tack on another 15 minutes or so we can get to a couple of more questions. And I wanted to ask Elaine, since you've done a little bit of lecturing about social media disinformation, misinformation. I wanted to just ask a question for you about that. We have several from the audience touching on this. One asking, just kind of a general question about what we make of rumors, kind of some of the viral rumors going around social media, such as the ghost of Kiev. What can Ukraine and its allies do to combat some of this this disinformation, this propaganda? Really just more broadly, given the fact that we have this expanded ability for misinformation to spread via social media, what do we do about this? What are journalists to do? What is the public to do?
Thanks, Jerry. That's a really great question. I mean, the bad news is it's a terribly widespread problem, and the good news is actually there's quite a lot of things that you can do. And I'll start with the sort of individual level. I mean, I would like to just point out that this is something we study here at IU and at the Observatory on Social Media. There are tools at our website. It's OSOME, awesome, OSOME.iu.edu. There are tools there where you can actually visualize the spread of disinformation and of fact-checking online. So that's one thing that you can do just to try and get a sense of the scale of the problem. There's a great organization called First Draft, which has a fantastic dashboard that anyone can use. It's very accessible, that helps you as an individual to understand how you can fact check information that you see online for yourself. And it shares a lot of tips and techniques and strategies. Of course, there are websites that you can go to who are in real time fact checking stories that have become very prevalent. The one that people mostly hear about is Snopes, S-N-O-P-E-S, Snopes.com. But most of the major news organizations have gotten in the business of this, including Reuters, which does fact checking, where I was for many years. And of course, there are others. Most big news organizations now are in the business of verifying information for their audiences and trying to reverse the tide, turn the tide of dis and misinformation that's out there. And of course, Sasha and his colleagues in Ukraine have been doing this for years at Stop Fake as well. And then I suppose, as far as just what can governments do, I mean, this is where it gets very complicated, obviously, because we understand now that when you tell people things and they're inclined to believe them, there's very little you can do to reverse their belief. And in the end, I think it's something I think Sasha said earlier, that when people start to see the economic costs of decisions that their governments are making, or sadly, when body bags start to come home or even don't come home, that's when people start to understand that maybe the assumptions or the propaganda that they have believed for so long is not true. And I would just finally say that it's really for journalists, like, if this is when we stand up and say, look, this is why you need us. We are the people who are trained to understand how to verify information and how to tell stories that are authentic and real, and get across the humanity, the suffering, the enormous scale of suffering that's happening in a credible way.
Thank you, Elaine. Steve, this is a question from a student at IU, I think, directly for you. In view of the images you showed, how do you get comfortable putting yourself in such dangerous situations and still get such clear, breathtaking pictures? How are you able to turn your focus from your safety to making sure you're properly documenting the events going on around you?
It's a good question. I'm not sure that my answer is up to the question. I think a lot of it has to do, Jerry, with, well, several things. One is your mindset, your focus. You're there as a representative of the public. You are putting yourself in this situation, not for your own gratification or curiosity, but because it's your job to bear witness and to be as faithful a witness as you can be. So that's the philosophy behind it. You're there to record something important for history or whatever. I think the other thing is training, Jerry, and the students in the audience training, is your training and experience take over. What is it? The American military says we fight like we train and we train like we fight. And I think that that's true in many professions, that when push comes to shove, you're not thinking about yourself. You're thinking about, how do I do this as intimately, as compassionately, and as accurately as I can, to in our courses, I remember, we get accurate, verified information as journalists, and we add meaning and context to it. And we add meaning and context to situations as photographers just as much as writers would. So training and our mindset, I think, and realizing that there's always something that could go wrong, and you do this willingly. I don't have anything beyond that. You say it to yourself, it's my job, and it's much like the heart surgeon, it's my job, and there's hopefully a better social outcome or a better outcome for our audience, our readers, our patients, if you're in the profession of medicine, at the other end. And so I don't know if that answers your question entirely, but I do think the importance of training can't be overstated.
Thank you for that. So another IU student, a grad student, asks a question about objectivity that will perhaps get us to our final question. And the question is this: how should foreign journalists, and I would maybe edit this to say, how should journalists approach the question of objectivity in such a lopsided war with a clear aggressor? It's a question with a point of view, for sure. Many journalists who are reporting are, making clear a point of view. Where does objectivity come into things? And I'll let any of you chime in on this.
I'll be happy to jump in. I mean, this is a word that gets thrown around a lot, and I think we're all struggling to understand what we mean by this word, or have done. Perhaps we're getting closer to it now because there are so many people in the conversation trying to say, no, I'm objective. No, I'm objective. I think in the end, for journalists, we can't kid ourselves on that we don't bring all of our experiences and our personal views and beliefs into the job with us, because we're human beings, and the job is to set that to one side. Sometimes when I talk to students about this, I say it's like you live your life in these two corridors. There's the corridor over here where you have your personal views, and there's a corridor over here where you're applying the tools and the techniques and the skills that you have learned as a journalist to your job of reporting. And it doesn't mean you're not still over here as well. You're still having opinions and views, and you need to be aware of them. But it's all about the techniques that you use in order to establish information and to present it as fairly and as clearly as you possibly can.
I think I'm not disagreeing with Elaine. I think objectivity is a process, and that we go through. It's a discipline, and part of that is verifying information and making sure that you're as right as you can be at the time. But I think we shouldn't confuse objectivity with neutrality. We can be objective. We can make a supreme effort to be fair, to be impartial, but at a certain time we cannot be neutral when war crimes, for example, are happening. The Russians have employed a thermal barrack rocket in Ukraine. This is banned under the Geneva Conventions, the rules of warfare, the international humanitarian law. These thermal barrack weapons, they are like giant flamethrowers that just suck the air out of people's lungs and vaporize them. There is no way, I think, to be on the one hand this and the other hand that when we're talking about the Russian implementation of weapons or Russian targeting. And I think sometimes we confuse objectivity with neutrality, and they really aren't the same thing, if that makes any sense.
I just want to agree with Steve and want to emphasize that, in my opinion, the most important thing is verification, is fact-checking. Every journalist, when publishing something, must be 100% sure that this information is correct. When we talk about objectivity in this strictly academic sense, I am personally cannot be objective in this situation, that's for sure. But I guess it's hard to be objective here when everything, or better to say, mostly everything is black and white, not gray. We have an aggression, we have war crimes, we have direct violations of international humanitarian law, and that's another story.
I did want to add one other thing, just I meant to mention earlier. I'm trying to remember exactly where I saw this. I think it was in MediaFire. There are tools that you can use online now, which advise you if you are in the field in Ukraine as whoever you are, and you think you have witnessed a war crime, that the ability to record that correctly is something that could be put to use later. So I would just mention that as another thing that people can think about as humans, not just as journalists, but just as human beings who have access to the tools and technology of media.
If we have time, just one final thought, Jerry, and my friends on the panel, is in the realm of objectivity. It's not that the Ukrainians are good and the Russians are wearing the black hats and they're the bad guys. I think that we owe it to our audience and to history to interview the Russians, soldiers, if that's possible. From what my wife has been reading in online blogs and so forth, that the first Russian troops to enter Ukraine were not Russian at all, but they were soldiers from Dagestan, which is a province or area of Russia in the southern Caucasus, and these soldiers would be Muslim, many of them, in fact, and they have employed soldiers who are poorly trained, who were not even told where they were, let alone that they were going to fight. And I think we owe it to everyone to try to get closer and at the Russian military, the Russian planning, the Russian side of the story. It's not a situation of a white hat and a black hat at all.
Thank you for those answers. So we're almost out of time. Well, we're out of time according to the schedule, but there's still quite a few folks left in the audience. I'm going to take the liberty of asking one more question, which some people save the softball questions for the end. As an old investigative reporter, I always like to save the tough question for the end. And so this is a tough question particularly for Western media professionals, practitioners. Western media outlets, a number of them have been come in for some fairly serious criticism about unfair depictions of or discrepant depictions of refugees from Ukraine versus refugees from other countries in other conflicts. And I just was going to read a couple of headlines related to this. One from the Washington Post, quote, "They seem so like us," end quote. "In depicting Ukraine's plight, some in media use offensive comparisons, reaching for context in the Russian invasion. Correspondents and pundits veer into a troubling tone on race and international status." An opinion piece from the Post, "Coverage of Ukraine has exposed long-standing racist biases in Western media." And from the Independent in UK, the racial bias in Western media's Ukraine coverage is shameful. It says, though bloodshed and invasion is only to be foisted upon countries inhabited by Black and brown people. I don't ask you all to answer for this or answer to this criticism, but I'm curious to get your thoughts about what we should think about this.
Jerry, do you want us to go in any particular order?
Yes, and I hope I laid a proper foundation for that. Feel free to take that one.
Yeah, no, I think it's an absolutely incredibly important question, maybe the most important one in a way, when you're thinking about journalism and its ethics. I mean, it strikes me as another reminder of how important it is to have diversity in newsrooms, and to have diversity in within the journalistic core and within the leadership and ownership of all newsrooms, because these are the kinds of questions that will otherwise not surface. I'll just note that Sarah, whose voice unfortunately you were not able to hear earlier, but has made such a huge impact with her reporting on CNN, was reporting on the difficulties with for African students in getting out of Ukraine, just for example, and some of the problems that people of color were having getting onto trains and so on. Now, of course, that's a very complicated situation, but these are those stories wouldn't necessarily be told if you don't have a diversity of humans in the journalistic body. And I think that's perhaps the most important thing for us to think about.
And just following up on Elaine's comments, which I totally agree with, is that words matter. You know, the idea of saying that this is a conflict, and we've heard this so often on television, that the conflict in Kharkiv or in Kiev or other cities, that there's a war in this beautiful civilized European city is being crushed and so forth. Words matter. Kabul is a civilized city. Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, at one time before it was pummeled, Sana'a, I've been there several times, is not only civilized, but it's a city of architectural magnificence in its own way in Yemen. And we have this, we in the Western media have this tendency to think only if there are white people here must there be, you know, this is a civilized place. And we run the risk of offending much of our audience with our words, and words matter. To put ourselves in the shoes of our audience, who our audience of colors, our audience of non-Western or non-American people, and certainly to try to get a little closer to the reality of the situation. I think, you know, we have to redouble our efforts if that's possible.
Well, thank you very much for those answers on a really tough question, and thank you all for being a part of this panel. And you know, Steve and Elaine, colleagues, I appreciate that, especially Sasha for joining us from Ukraine. I want to turn it over now just for a few final words to Media School Senior Alex Hardgrave, who is president of IU's chapter of Reporters Without Borders, and that chapter was co-sponsor of this panel along with the Media School. So thank you all very much, and here to you, Alex.
Yeah, on behalf of Reporters Without Borders, thank you to everyone who attended, and thank you to our speakers for sharing your expertise today on this important and timely topic. Thank you as well to everyone who put this event together. Being a journalist has always come with its risks, but our thoughts are with those currently reporting in the conflict, as well as everyone else who is living in danger and those who've already lost their lives. Journalism is important and cannot be overlooked, especially as we combat misinformation surrounding the topic. I urge everyone to keep up with the news from credible sources because knowledge is power. Thank you again and have a great day.